education from attack. It is a privilege to moderate this important conversation on the right to education during armed conflict. Before we begin, I'd first like to take the opportunity to thank the organizations involved in designing and supporting our conversation today. First, thank you to the co-organizers of this event, Right to Education and the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Our hope is that after today's conversation, you will continue engaging with your colleagues about the questions that we will all consider here today. Special thanks to the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies and the Global Education Cluster for providing facilitated language translation in Spanish, French, and Arabic. We'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that there has been a last-minute change to our speaker lineup. As you may have noticed in our extensive advertisement of this event, our initial panel included Acting Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, Ms. Najat Ma'ala Amjid, and UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, Ms. Farida Shahid. Unfortunately, at the last moment, they have had to both send their regrets and are unable to attend today's event. However, members of their respective teams are here to represent the mandate and help us clarify any questions we might have about their work during our question and answer portion of today's event. Please welcome Milan Bedot and Maria Smirnova. Just a few quick notes to help things run smoothly today. This event will last 90 minutes, and we encourage you to stay with us for the full conversation. The webinar is being recorded, and interpretation is available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. If you need interpretation, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, choose your language, and select Mute Original Audio to hear only the interpreter. If you have any questions with interpretation, please write your concerns in the chat box, and we will be glad to help. We encourage you to engage fully during the short amount of time we have together. As this is a large group, and not everyone will have the chance to speak, we encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, share resources, and submit questions for clarification and curiosity. We invite speakers to answer any clarifying questions directly in the chat that audience members may pose. Depending on the question asked, we may choose to raise it live to our panel during our open Q&A time together. We consider the chat a space for parallel dialogue about today's topic and expect all participants to engage over the chat in respectful and responsible ways. Finally, we ask you to please keep your microphone muted unless you're invited to speak. I encourage us all to take a moment to make sure that that is accomplished. With that, let's get started. Attacks on education are rising at an alarming pace, undermining the fundamental right to learn free from discrimination and violence. According to our research at GCPEA, the number of people harmed in such attacks more than doubled in 2024 compared to 2023, with sharp increases in contacts from the DRC and Palestine to Haiti, Mozambique, and Colombia. The most recent UN Children in Armed Conflict report confirmed 41,370 grave violations against children in 2024, the highest figure in nearly 30 years. This included a 44% rise in attacks on schools. While today's presentation will focus on case studies from specific regions, we sadly recognize that these violations are happening around the globe and emphasize that protecting education everywhere is inseparable from protecting human rights. Today, our speakers will not only present new evidence related to education during armed conflict, but also grapple with the fundamental tensions that shape how this evidence is used. We know that policymakers often argue that there is not enough reliable data to act. Researchers insist that the data does exist, but it's underutilized. Legal experts remind us that without accountability, even the most comprehensive evidence may fail to make a difference. And communities on the ground ask, why are we waiting for perfect data sets when schools are under attack right now? This is where the dilemma becomes urgent. In conflict-affected settings, Waiting for the perfect, complete, and extensively verified data can mean paralysis. By the time reports are finalized, children may already have been recruited into armed groups, teachers may have been threatened or displaced, and schools may have been destroyed. On the other hand, moving too quickly with partial or imperfect data carries its own risks. Inaccuracies can undermine credibility, and accountability processes demand rigor. Today's panel brings together multiple actors, researchers, advocates, international organizations, artists, journalists, and legal experts, because each brings a different vantage point on this dilemma. Our challenge is not only to document attacks on education, but to think creatively and collectively about how we move from evidence to protection, even when the evidence is incomplete. I invite us to hold these tensions in mind as we hear from our distinguished speakers today. My goal as your moderator is to connect their perspectives, the data, the policy realities, and the ethical and legal imperatives into one conversation that identifies not only the challenges, but the pathways forward. And we'll also engage in discussions with you, our audience, about better ways to make sure that evidence leads to action, even in politically sensitive and high-risk environments. I invite you to ask questions of curiosity from those whose perspectives you seek to understand better. So let's begin. To help us step back and reflect on the big picture, I'm pleased to turn now to Rola Umene from the Right to Education program at UNESCO, who will provide a broader framing on the right to education in emergencies and crises. In crisis-affected contexts, documenting violations of the right to education may be difficult and dangerous, yet such evidence is vital. Ms. Umene is here to share how international mechanisms, including UNESCO's monitoring work, might better connect with and elevate local monitoring to drive global accountability and decision-making. Ms. Umene, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bacha. Can you see my screen? Good. So let me just put it in full screen. Okay, please let me know if it doesn't work. It works, I guess. So thank you. No, thank you very much for this invitation. I am very honored to be part of this discussion, a very important discussion, and very timely. I think it's my pleasure to present maybe today to start with this presentation on how UNESCO is monitoring, and as you said, to provide the global picture, how UNESCO is monitoring the right to education in crisis affected and emergency context. Maybe I will start with maybe just recalling UNESCO's mission in monitoring the right to education. Obviously, a right to education is, and this is widely, I think, recognized, not contested, that education is a human right, and every human being has the right to quality education, but also lifelong learning opportunities. This is a right that was enshrined in the Universal Declaration, but also further developed in the set of international standard-setting instruments that further enshrine and develop the specific components of the right to education, and covering the different aspects of the right to education very comprehensively. So very, very quickly, just to mention that when it comes to UNESCO's work to advance and enforce the right to education, this is done through three different, I would say, areas of intervention. We do the monitoring of the implementation of the right to education, and this monitoring is used to inform country-level work, country-level support. So we are supporting countries and governments to better implement and align the normative policy frameworks at country level with international standards. But we also try to unpack the state legal obligations under the right to education and the different principles to better understand what are concretely the component and what are the implications when it comes to concrete implementation of the right to education in the face of emerging challenges. Crisis, conflict, but also when it comes to our work, climate disasters, health emergency, economic shocks are increasingly disrupting education. This is very well documented, and we have several important impacts that directly relate to school closures in many contexts, lack of alternative learning modalities very often, of course, threats to health, but also safety, well-being, and reduce funding and also planning capacity. And UNESCO consider education is extremely important to protect in times of crisis and emergency situations. It's essential, immediate, and life-saving need in all the contexts. So we have obviously sustainable development emphasizes flexible education for crisis-affected population that is also inclusive. We have the recent recommendation on education for peace, human rights, sustainable development, and more recently, Fortaleza Declaration adopted in last November reaffirms global commitment to equity, inclusion, and sustainable financing in emergency. We know school closures heighten risk of violence, exploitation, recruitment into armed group. Crisis also worsen existing inequalities, and education must be prioritized from day one of any humanitarian response. And the right to education is clearly non-derogative. It must be protected at all times. And what's important is to consider the short-term responses, but also at the same time to design the long-term responses. So protect inclusive quality education, enhance distance and digital learning, offer, of course, mental health and psychosocial support countries with reliable education data and monitor damages to infrastructure, and also long-term solutions and responses, strengthen education system through crisis-sensitive planning and curriculum development, and promote safe, inclusive, equitable education. Sorry, I will try to accelerate a bit. So some key priorities to consider in crisis context. So ensure equitable, non-discriminatory access to the right to education by adopting intersectional approach that addresses socio-emotional needs, flexible learning modalities, and the humanitarian development nexus. Protect and empower teachers. This is key, guaranteeing also their safety, psychological well-being, and most importantly as well, ongoing professional development. Strengthen accountability mechanisms for right to education through reliable, disaggregated data, and we'll be discussing, enabling evidence-based policy and monitoring of right fulfillment, secure, predictable, and sustainable funding to uphold right to education in all the context, and prioritizing investments in local actors who understand and address community-specific needs, and implement long-term strategies to guarantee educational continuity, ensuring education remains available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable throughout crisis, fully aligned with international standards. So allow me now just to zoom and maybe present a recent work that we did in a specific context. I would say monitoring the right to education and analyzing the situation of the right to education implementation in the context of Afghanistan. Conducting this work was really important because, as we all know, I think Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls are systematically barred from education beyond the primary level. And there is a clear need to assess the broad and long-term consequences of shifts in education policies and regulation that we observed for the recent years. We developed a report on the implementation of the right to education for the last 4 years, 4 years, starting August 2021 with the takeover. So in terms of purpose, we consider this report as a key advocacy tool, highlighting intersecting challenges faced by Afghans, and also presenting some actionable recommendations, policy pointers for possible change. And when it comes to the methodology, the analysis was based on a solid research and based also on key informant interviews that we managed to conduct as part of the research. So maybe I will present very briefly the findings. So first, starting with access and participation. So among the findings, I will try to summarize in a kind of very brief way. So girls are banned from attending school after primary education. Economic and humanitarian crises have driven boys as well out of schools and led to a sharp drop in enrollment. Also, delays in disability allowance and civil servants' pensions are further limiting families' abilities actually to support the education of their children. And when it comes also some findings when it comes to the quality of education, we noticed that students' learning is impacted by timetable changes and uneven curriculum implementation. Also, hiring practices raised concern with sometimes suspicious of political ties outweighing merit, and this is from some key informant interviews as well. Resources management shifts have worsened conditions in many schools, and teachers' salaries have been substantially reduced. There are also some findings when it comes to the legal framework of the right to education in the national context. So Afghanistan legal framework has become I would say unclear. I put it unclear and even unevenly interpreted, with sometimes directives that are shared informally. Also, the Independent Human Rights Commission was disbanded, and with the consequences of weakening protections. Also, I would say, and this we know, the international community has been voicing deep concerns about the severe human rights impact of policies, but we also know that the de facto authorities have not formally denounced any international treaties so far. And I would mention that the definition of child based on the absence of physical sign of puberty jeopardizes the right to education of children, exposing also children. Also, beyond maybe beyond this, I would just mention also that So there are multiple and multifaceted hardships, with Afghanistan being the sixth most vulnerable country to climate change. Also, Afghans constituted the second largest refugees population, with many of them staying in neighboring countries. Limited access to health care facilities, combined with poor or non-existent education and employment prospect, has led to devastating effects on the mental health, especially of girls and women. And also the power shift resulted in reduction in economic activity, and was further exacerbated by the halt of international aid that led to economic disruption. So maybe just some from this research and data collected and analysis conducted in the context of this report, we have some kind of actionable policy pointers with some pathways for change. So in the medium to long term, sustained advocacy and diplomatic pressure to lift restrictions. Girls' education must remain central to diplomatic effort and foreign aid. Leveraging UN mechanisms, donors, platforms, and regional actors is very important to restore post-primary education, access for girls, and also reversing learning risks and rebuilding an inclusive system require major investments in large remedial and bridging programs. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for setting the stage for this conversation today. And we look forward to hearing more about those key findings from that study later on in the panel. So now that we have more of the big picture, let's look at some illustrative examples. I'm pleased to introduce next Ms. Juliana Lima, project manager with the Right to Education Initiative, who will present our first case study today on the Sahel. In addition to illustrating how a child's right to education can be impacted daily during conflict and insecurity, Ms. Lima's presentation will also provide commentary on the importance of integrating community-generated evidence into global policy discussions. Ms. Lima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alison, for this presentation. Actually, indeed, we will be talking about integrating local communities. It's only because we worked hand in hand with our local partners that this research that I will be presenting today was possible. And as I will explain, they are the main drivers of this research, because they are the ones who contacted us for technical support, wishing to conduct a study on the impact of on monitoring the right to education in the conflict zones. Do you see my screen? Well, everybody is able to see it? Okay, great. So I will be presenting you perspectives from Central Sahel. Maybe I would just, yeah. This is better.
Juliana?
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
This is better.
Yeah, this is better. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks. This project, it's a pilot project that initiated with what we consider was a cry for help from our local partners. Indeed, we were contacted by Amnesty International Netherlands and local civil society organizations in Mali, Burkina, and Niger. And they were not particularly civil society organizations that worked particularly in education, nor even less education in emergency settings, but they were alarmed and concerned by what they observed in the ground. And that's why this project starts with their own need and their own desire to look further and to look close to what happens with the kids when they're not at school. And we decided to focus the pilot project on the impact of school closures on children's rights, especially in their right to education, which is something that is crucial but understudied nowadays. We have a lot of data concerning number of attacks on education, and we'll be discussing a lack of data, but we still do have some data on all those on attacks on education and a number of school closures and so on. But there is very little research on what happens with the kids when they are out of school and for how long they have been out of school. So this is the focus of our study, with the goal to be able to collect data, analyze, and present it to governments to support them in their efforts to protect and implement the right to education in the region. We decided to focus on the Liptako-Gourmal region, which is the region in the frontier of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And the study was conducted in Mali and Niger. Unfortunately, we were not able to conduct a study in Burkina Faso. But we are hoping we would be able to do it soon. And I will be presenting today the findings from Mali. But what I can say is that what our partners in Burkina observe, and also what our research on Niger revealed, is very similar. So we're going to be presenting findings on Mali, but similar trends are observed across the three countries. So this study on Mali was conducted in 4 regions: Douentza, Badiangara, Gao, and Tombouctou. And we collected data during 6 months, from July to December 2024, with a sample of 740 households, representing 1,607 children, distributed, including IDPs and non-displaced children. So among the 740 households, we had 2 target groups. So we targeted both IDPs, households with children that had been displaced, and households with children that were not displaced, despite closure of schools in their region and insecurity. We also had the opportunity to discuss with 46 school directors, both from non-functional schools, the schools that are closed, were closed at least during the period of the research, and schools that were hosting IDPs. And we also discussed with 27 representatives of local governments for a perspective on implementation of education and emergency policies. We'll not be presenting all the results, but just a few results. Before I go into the main findings of our research, I would like to present a few limits. So this is not an exhaustive study. It's limited. We had time constraints. We had financial constraints. So it's a limited study, but it's actually brings some very interesting information. The sampling was not randomized. So because of many different challenges encountered in the field, interviewees were selected via enumerators networks. So we worked closely with teachers and local communities representatives that were trained for the research, but it might represent a potential bias on the research. Another very important limit of these studies is that children's perspectives are absent. So we only interviewed and discussed with parents, because our team was not trained for child-sensitive approach for the research. And also it's difficult to compare all the results, because Niger and Mali have very similar situation, very similar trends, but there are specificities of each country, and also different on the size of the samples. A first key finding that I would like to share with you is that an overwhelmingly majority of children concerned by the study have been deprived of access to education, and for too long. In total, there were 81% of the children represented in the survey are out of school. That we have a higher rate between non-displaced students and a smaller rate between internally displaced students, but it's also still quite high. 85% of non-displaced children out of school and 75% of surveyed displaced children out of school. What is more alarming is that non-displaced children have been out of school for over 2 years, and parents and directors, all the different interviews converge to say that the situation has been going on for too long, but uninterruptedly, non-displaced children have been out of school for over 2 years. And all levels of education are concerned in both categories, displaced and non-displaced children, with an interruption varying between 6 and 18 months, so a time less time than for those who are not displaced regarding displaced children. Second important finding is that some schools have been de facto closed. So we discussed with 27 directors of schools that were non-functional during the time of the survey. And what we learned is that only 5 of those 27 schools were officially declared closed. That means that most of all the other 22 schools were closed de facto with no official central decision, meaning that it was either the director or the mayor or the sub-prefect that decided on the school closure. And we don't know, because we didn't go this far. We don't know to what extent these numbers are being considered in the official numbers of school closures, since they have not been officially declared closed. And what the directors explain is that the main driver of their decision to close school is the widespread attacks on village and communities by non-state armed groups, but they are also driven by generalized insecurity that prevents teachers from working. So teachers simply do not want to go to work because they are afraid of going to work, and also in some cases direct attack on schools. We also discussed with directors of schools that host displaced children, and what they testify, or they give a testimony that their schools are also affected by closures, sometimes for a more temporary, or lesser extent duration of time. Third important key finding is that there have been reports of use of school for military purposes, use of schools by non-governmental armed forces that are using schools for military purposes. We did not identify which armed movements are responsible for this, but we actually identified 8 reports of schools being used for shelter, for weapons and ammunition storage, and 1 report with regards to school being used as a field hospital. Another finding that I would like to share with you that is very interesting, because it concretely shows the interdependence of different human rights. We were able to analyze and have evidence to prove that lack of implementation of the right to education undermines the enjoyment of other rights. So really reinstating this idea that the right to education is a catalytic right that enables other rights. So we identified child labor, early marriage, engagement into armed groups. So I'll just share a few of those results with you. So for example, alarming number of early marriage between displaced girls, with 79% of displaced girls aged from 13 to 15 already married. And we should remind you that in Mali, the marital age for girls is 16 years old, and the marital age for boys is 18 years old. And data has demonstrated that almost 90% of displaced girls aged 15 to 18 were already married, by the time of our survey, so between July and December 2024. For non-displaced girls, the rates are a little lower, but they are still very concerning, with 11% of girls aged 15 to 18 already married by the time of the survey. Another very alarming result is the engagement percentage of boys engaged into armed group activities. So the survey demonstrated that 53% of displaced boys aged 13 to 15 are engaged in non-state armed groups, according to their parents, of course, because as I said, we did not discuss directly with the children. And 81% of displaced boys aged 15 and 18 years old engaged in non-state armed groups. Among non-displaced boys, the rates are a little lower, around 13% of non-displaced boys between 13 and 18 years old that were engaged in non-state armed groups, according to their parents. And this is a reality that we particularly observed in the Gao region. So just a reminder, we conducted a research in 4 regions. And in the Gao region, the armed group engagement of young children, mostly boys, but we also have interesting findings on girls that I won't have time to share. But particularly, it's a problem, particularly in Gao, in the Gao region. Parents also recalled change in children behavior both in non-displaced children and displaced children, with alarming information regarding children that do not want to go back to school. So 80% of displaced boys do not want to go back to school. I'm going to wrap up very quickly right now. Alison, I know I am running late. So what we would like to stress is that the state of Mali has national legal policies and legal bases and policies that protect the right to education, including in emergency situations, and has international commitments to which he is bound to protect the right to education during crisis. But what we observe is limited implementation in surveyed regions with a weak state presence in affected areas, and local authorities that lack guidance and dedicated budget. Also, most of the parents we interviewed are not aware of the education in emergency policies, which can be a problem because they do not know where to turn to when their kids are out of school and when schools are closed. So I will keep it here for now, Alison, and we can continue the discussion during the following the discussion later on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of local evidence, and particularly the challenges of incorporating children's voices, yet emphasizing the need to do so. So your presentation raises the broader question of how do we ensure that insights like this are translated into timely action without waiting for a perfect data set, which now leads me to introduce our next 2 speakers, Gautier Mochet, and a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and Jerome Marston, head of research at Kobo Toolbox, who approached the same challenge from additional context. So I'm going to pose a question to both of you and ask Gautier to begin with Jerome following. So too often, local teacher or community testimonies are treated as anecdotal rather than systematic data. I'm curious, based on what you've brought today, how we expand our definition of valid evidence to ensure that community voices are not sidelined in research on attacks on education. So Gautier, if you could begin, and then we will invite Jerome's contributions directly after.
Thanks, Alison, and Thanks, Juliana and Delphine and everyone at RTE for organizing this. So yes, that's a very important question. I personally do not think that we need to extend our definition of what counts as valid evidence. From my understanding and knowledge of the literature, there has been a study done by Cyril Benuna a few years ago, which proves basically that the most accurate data and the most detailed data on violence against education comes from local education networks, local education actors, in comparison, for example, to other types of data sets. And this is something that we've also been doing in our work, trying to compare different data sources. So I think the data that comes from the communities and the local actors and the local educators is the most accurate that there is. And it's really a question of actually proving that academically, I mean, forcefully making that message academically, making it come across so that systems can be put in place to collect that type of data. So I don't think we necessarily need to extend our definition of what counts as valid evidence, but that's a personal take on it. It's more, showing that actually this is absolutely valid evidence.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to your presentation today.
Sorry, and should I start my presentation? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry. Just a second. So this. Okay. So yes, thanks again. So I'm going to be talking about the causes and consequences of violence against teachers in the DRC and in Niger. And I'm presenting on behalf of the wider team, Samuel Matabishi, Diego de la Fuente Stevens, Jean-Benoît Fallis, Cyril Brandt, Dieudonné Kanyerwa, Ibrahim Safari, Jean Mukwingere Basengezi, and Pacific Nyabagaza. So this is work that builds on the EU-funded Building Resilience in Crisis Through Education project, which was led by the Institute of Development Studies and the Institut Supérieur Pédagogique de Bukavu, which is in Bukavu. The work covered DRC and Niger. There were a range of results, but there was a strong focus on violence against teachers, which is a key yet relatively understudied question in the literature. And you can find summaries of the research in this book called Education and Resilience in Crisis. So today I wanted to focus on the causes of violence against teachers, the impact on teachers' mental health and well-being, and also on dealing with violence and trauma. I'll just say a few words about an ongoing project there because I won't have much time. Okay, so just broadly about the approach, we used a mixed methods approach over 4 years, a longitudinal approach and a comparative approach. We had a quantitative component where we covered 55 schools in the DRC, 932 teachers, and in Niger, 71 schools and 609 teachers. So this was for the quantitative component, and we embedded a range of measures of teacher well-being, also measures of exposure to violence, recall methods, et cetera. And then we had a qualitative component with 211 interviews in the DRC, 129 in Niger, with mainly teachers, head teachers, inspectors, local authorities, traditional leaders, but also military officers. And importantly, teachers themselves were part of the research team, particularly through our partnership with the Institut Supérieur Pédagogique de Bukavu. And we followed a whole range of ethical protocols, which I won't develop here, but I'm happy to come back to those later on. So a first very important result is that there is high exposure to violence of teachers in these regions. I hope you can see my screen. There are a lot of things popping on my screen, but I hope you can see it correctly, the graph there. So that's a graph over time since the 1990s of exposures of school and teacher to violence in our study schools in the DRC. And we have 43.3% of teachers who reported that in our study schools who reported that they had experienced at least one direct violent attack in their lives. This is a considerable number. It's a very high number. Although it's not necessarily representative for sampling reasons, it's still an important evidence that there is underreporting of violence against teachers. And what drove us is that there is still a partial understanding of what are the causes of violence against teachers. So we delved into the causes of violence against teachers, specifically in the DRC. And we found a range of causes operating at three main levels. The first is the political economy level, which has to do with the position of schools and teachers in militarized political economies, whereby schools and teachers are subjected to various forms of extortion, common extortion that touches the entire population in those regions, but also specifically targeted extortion tied to, for example, school budgets or the fact that teachers receive regular pay. But extortion is just a part of the story, actually, because armed groups and armed actors interfere in school governance in multiple ways because of the symbolic and political capital of school, which is coveted by the armed actors and the armed groups in those types of contexts. There can be configurations of protections of school by armed actors, and there can be various forms of interference in school governance, from teacher deployment to exams. And this is one of the overarching kind of drivers of violence against teachers. A second overarching driver is the social position of teachers in these types of contexts, which has multiple facets: their identity, their social status, and their relationship to armed actors. With regards to their identity, it's really when there are salient identities which correspond to the lines of polarization in a particular context, in a particular armed conflict, such as ethnicity or local identities in Eastern DRC, which are highly polarized as a result of the violent conflict. That can expose teachers to violence. It can be religion, which we found played less of a role in the DRC, but more so in Niger. It can also be tied to the social status of teachers. Teachers are what Cyril Brandt called reluctant representatives of the state, including in some areas the only representatives of the state, so that can expose them to violence. But they are also still, in many rural areas, perceived as notables or as intellectuals, as elites, and thus they can crystallize a form of social jealousy that can, in certain cases, manifest in violence. Because they are notables, because they have this position as relative elites, they can be solicited for negotiations with armed actors. They can play the role of intermediaries with armed actors, and that can also expose them to violence as well. And the third broad level at which there are a range of causes of violence against teachers is basically the amplification of school level disputes. So school level conflicts and disputes which happen in any school, and the vast majority of which aren't violent, can, in these types of contexts, spill out of school and become violent as a result of the social implantation of armed actors. And here I put some figures on the fact that many teachers have social acquaintances with armed actors, people in armed groups, which shows the social implantation of armed actors, and violence becoming a modus operandi to settle disputes in these regions. So it can be a range of types of disputes, student-related disputes around exams, grades, discipline in the classroom, tensions among teachers and school staff around the status of teacher, for example, around teacher deployment, or the discrimination that might exist in the teaching profession, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't consider that these results are necessarily generalizable because there are limitations to the representativity of our sample. And we also consider that other causes may play a more important role in other contexts, but nevertheless, we believe that this holds some lessons for other contexts as well. And these results are presented in a dedicated article. So moving on to the impact on mental health. So here I'm including the data on Niger. We find a significant association between violence and PTSD using the self-reported PTSD checklist, but also embedding other measures of trauma that we built with ISP Bukavu so that they can be culturally and contextually relevant. Here we find statistically significant effects, negative effects, positive effects. So higher level of violence impacts, gives a higher level of PTSD, and a higher impact on female teachers. So this is clear evidence of a mental health effect of this violence. And in Niger, for example, teachers spoke of a psychose, a nervousness, which is experienced both individually and collectively in the teaching profession. moving on to the impact on well-being and teaching practices. So we had a whole range of measures in the survey. So 24 indicators across 4 categories on motivation, satisfaction, feedback to students, whether or not they practice corporal punishment, interaction with students. And here we find a negative association of PTSD with these different indexes. So to sum it up, what we find is empirical proof that violence causes trauma among teachers. At least there is an association with trauma among teachers, and that there is an association, an impact on their well-being and their teaching practices. So you'll tell me this is not surprising at all, and I agree. I mean, it's kind of what you would expect, and especially as a community of people who work on these issues, I'm sure a lot of you would expect this type of result. Nevertheless, I think it's very important to document it and to measure it in context of ongoing violence as in the DRC. And for these results, they're under review, but there is a version that is available online of this paper. So I wanted to say something, because I'm running out of time, about an ongoing project we have, which is led by Professor Samuel Matabishi at the Institut Supérieur Pédagogique de Bukavu. Here, the idea is to train teachers who will be deployed in those types of contexts, not so that they can, deal with the entire kind of political situation there, but so that they can have some tools to deal with the violence, some pedagogical tools to deal with violence and with trauma, and embed that within the pre-service training of teachers in the DRC. So the module is being developed at the Institut Supérieur Pédagogique de Bukavu, and it's being scaled up at the national level. And the idea here is to really embed the expertise of ISP Bukavu on issues such as sociolinguistics, peace education, but also the expertise on trauma that exists in Eastern DRC in institutions like ISP Bukavu, but also like the Panzi Hospital in Bukavu as well. So I'll stop here because I think I went a little bit overboard, but I'm of course open to question, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much. You did not go overboard. That was perfectly timed. Jerome, can I pass it to you next?
Absolutely. Thank you, Allison. First off, in response to your question, thank you for it. And I should say as well that I am Jerome Marston. I'm the head of research at Kobo. Thanks to Allison for hosting and for Right to Education and GCPA for the invitation. And to dive into your question, in many ways, I agree with my colleague. There's often a premium on data from the field and hearing narratives and testimonies from affected populations, although I still think we have the obligation to corroborate and triangulate that data, and that can be part of bringing it to a wider audience and ensuring that the wider audience recognizes that that data is reliable. Let me now jump into my presentation. So I am going to speak with you all about a project led by Kobo and in collaboration with the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, as well as with support from Education Above All. The project is to document attacks on education in Colombia, and I'm going to focus on the impacts of these attacks and responses and prevention measures to these attacks today. Before I really dive in, as a big picture overview, the project is, like I mentioned, documenting attacks on education in Colombia. The one goal was to produce data that would be visualized on the TRACE data portal. That's the track attacks on education data portal through a Colombia-specific dashboard, which would be available in both languages, both Spanish and English, and then also to produce a research report and a methodological guide and some tools for partners to use. So that's really the big picture. In this presentation today, I will discuss the field research to collect the data. I will share some findings from the Colombia dashboard on TRACE with a focus on impacts and responses to attacks. And then I will also go over some preliminary research findings from the project. The preliminary findings are just that, they're preliminary and they won't be out until November, but the Columbia dashboard will launch tomorrow, marking the International Day to Protect Education from Attack. So you all will be able to find it on the Trace Data Portal page. So diving into the field research, to give you all an overview, we carried out a large-scale survey in 4 of Colombia's most affected departments, affected by attacks on education specifically. These are Antioquia, Chocó, Norte de Santander, and Nariño. Primarily, the surveys were carried out in remote rural schools, some of them hours away by boat or bus. We conducted the surveys in over 500 schools, or I should better say about 500 schools. We spoke with over 500 head teachers about the schools where they were the head teacher. And then we also spoke with a couple over 300 teachers about their experiences as teachers in conflict affected areas. The focus of the survey was very much contextualized to the Colombian context. So we looked extensively at attacks on education common in Colombia, including child recruitment, military use, the use of improvised explosive devices, shootouts near schools and the like, as opposed to things like, let's say, aerial bombings or some of the kidnappings that you might see in other contexts. So everything was meant to look at attacks on education in Colombia specifically. I won't dive into it, but there were rigorous ethical and safety measures taken, including an ethical review and having surveyors from local areas to help protect their safety and also to put research participants at ease. We use Kobo Toolbox for the survey, which works offline, so that allowed us to collect the data in these remote areas. It also provides encrypted upload and secure servers, so all of the data was securely stored. And we drew on resources from the larger sector. These include the GCPA toolkit, as well as some studies from the Institute of Development Studies, which, of course, my colleague was just discussing. So let me dive into some of the analyses that we present on the Trace Data Portal. The Trace Data Portal is a larger platform that shares resources and education about attacks on education. Up to this point, there's primarily been GCPA data on the platform from the Education Under Attack report. But as I mentioned, now we will also have this Columbia data, and the plan is to build this out further. Trace is meant as a resource for journalists, education specialists, legal experts, policymakers, decision makers, others working on the topic of attacks on education, and to try and prevent and respond to this attack, to these attacks. The study that we carried out and the data that we'll be visualizing include documenting 600 attacks on education. As you all can see from the breakdown on the screen, many of these were attacks on schools, including shootouts near schools and explosive devices, but there were also attacks on students and teachers, particularly threats against teachers, as well as military use and some other forms of attacks. In these attacks, 140 students and teachers were harmed or killed, unfortunately. And then let me discuss some of the impacts, and this actually dovetails quite a bit with the presentation from my colleague earlier. So, well, both colleagues really, Juliana's presentation as well. So after attacks, nearly 20% of students struggled to learn, and after attacks, girls were more likely to drop out than boys. 25% of teachers experienced PTSD symptoms. And after attacks, a 1 week closure was average. And sometimes the closures would be due to threats or a very, very minimal amount of damage to the school. But other times we would see schools closed for months at a time. And certain groups of students, including Afro-Colombian students, Indigenous students, students with disabilities, were disproportionately and differentially affected in these attacks. And then let me briefly touch on response to attacks. One thing that we brought up in these surveys was asking teachers what kind of responses they wanted to see after an attack, whether that be from the government or NGOs as part of the peace building process in Colombia. Teachers in particular called for mental health and psychosocial support. They also called for safer school buildings and routes, including early warning systems, stronger school construction, security trainings and protocols, and the like. Since threats against teachers are quite common in the Colombian context, it was common for teachers to call for quick and safe relocation after they receive a threat. And then also state presence, access to government services, accountability, and human rights. And then let me also go over some preliminary research findings quickly. So these, move out from the dashboard that will go up on Trace, and these will be forthcoming in a report. So one that I really want to highlight is the link between military use and attacks. This is a link that has been seen before. Some GCPA reports, for instance, in Myanmar show this link, as well as in other countries. And so this was another opportunity to look into that link. And we found that a significant number of schools that were used for military purposes were subsequently attacked by rival forces or armed groups. So we're further documenting that link. I also want to point out that schools nearby police stations were at particular risk, and this would be because non-state armed groups would attack a police station or a military base in these remote areas, and that would put the school at risk, and students would have to hide under desks and then hide behind secure walls and the like. And then I also want to highlight that some schools were slower to reopen after attacks. And this seemed to be the case regardless of the type of violence that they faced. And so in response to that, the recommendation would be to prioritize primary schools, rural schools, and schools serving indigenous students. I'll go ahead and leave the presentation there. Thank you again for the invite.
Thank you so much to you both. Together, your research emphasizes the importance of hearing from educators directly to understand their unique perspectives on these impacts. And I definitely appreciated the statement about teachers being reluctant representatives of the state. So I thank you for your presentation, both of you. So we started the webinar framing our conversation around many of the tensions associated with data related to attacks on education. Our last two speakers round out this panel with two complementary perspectives: the human stories that remind us why this work matters, and the challenges of documenting those stories in ways that can drive change. So next, we'll turn to Diego Ibarra Sanchez, whose photography chronicles the lived realities of education under attack. And then we'll hear from Delphine Dorsey, who will reflect on the broader challenges and perspectives in documenting these violations and what it means for advocacy and accountability. Diego, your photography captures aspects of attacks on education that statistics alone cannot convey. I'm curious to learn more from you in your presentation about the role you see for storytelling and imagery in complementing traditional data and prompting action from decision makers. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Alison. Thanks so much, Delphine, and everyone that is on board today with the same goal to raise concerns about the attacks on education. From my side, as a visual storyteller, what I can add into this narrative is more about to humanize all this data, all this research, all the access you gather, and to humanize, no? And please, Delphine is going to share right now with you a small presentation I prepared for this moment. And if you can go ahead.
I'm not hearing the audio.
We don't hear it, Delphine. Yeah. Now we're here, but we don't see anything. You're muted, so we don't hear you.
So I'm saying I do it again because my microphone was off. That's why you couldn't hear. So do it again.
I believe we need to share the screen.
I'm so sorry. Let's do it again. Sorry. Everything is going to be in order. Yes, if I don't share the screen, you cannot see it. So, okay, now it's going to work.
Thanks very much. I'm really sorry. I apologize for the technical problems surrounding these video presentations, but just to give you an idea about what there is behind the world, what the world left behind the numbers, the statistics, the studies, the researchers, because as storytellers, we try to humanize the tragedy, the consequences of the war. No? So I would like to share one document. Preview, enter full screen. This is my long project, Hijack Education. It's a long-term photographic investigation into how war, extremism, and forced displacement affects and dismantle one of the most fundamental human rights, the right to education. Since 2012, I've been documenting the silent and structural crisis across geographies scarred by conflict like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, Sahel, Colombia, to try to raise questions and to create memory through my pictures rather than aestheticizing the violence or reinforcing the victimhood. My work tried to embrace an ethical approach that centers into dignity, silence, and resistance, refusing about the idea of sensationalism. But war, unfortunately, doesn't end with the last bullet or the silence of the ceasefire. No, its consequences metastasize across generations. So the conflict lingers, casting in shadows over an uncertain horizons. The open wounds of blood write the future of thousands and millions of kids. We're talking about that maybe 264 million children worldwide has the lack of opportunity, remains out of school. And at the end, the idea is to try to raise this question and to humanize. Of course, that numbers studies are amazing, but we need to go a big further, no? One step forward. For example, with this picture, trying to evoke, instead of giving you stereotype answers, I want to raise questions. How Joseph, no, holding all these old books, is standing in an abandoned and destroyed school during the caliphate, during the war against the ISIS. I'm son of a teacher. I'm father. I've been working on these projects since maybe 2009, during my first approach to the SWAT Valley in Pakistan after the iron fist of the regime of Mullah FM. At that time, Mullah FM, a huge Taliban commander, was beheading all the opposition and was not allowing people to go to the schools. No, and then after that, with the Taliban attempt of assassination of Malala, it makes like a turning point for my career, from my point of view. I start traveling across the world, trying to create memory, trying to focus in the remains untold stories. I'm not a parachuter. I'm trying to go deep. I'm not trying to be this rock star covering war, scratching the surface of the reality. I'm trying to create memory. And I thought that the problematic of education is still and remains an untold story, because the impact war of on education is huge, but we need to humanize. Like this picture took it in Saturday in 2016. No, how the 2020. Escaping from the prison, they took some houses, and it was quite violent moment for all the civilians surrounding around. No, we are, as researchers, storytellers, educators, we're always coming to the same point when we are talking about how war affects education. We are talking about schools that have been destroyed, militarized, used by different actors, always the same, repeating the same patterns in all the countries I visit. Can be official actors, armed actors. It's the same, using the schools as a base. Are quite helpful, to gather the troops, to launch attacks, and something that we have to stop thinking about that. The risk journey on the way to the school is another topic repeating in all the countries where are affected by war. The denial of access and the lost generation out of the school. The teachers, they've been persecuted, killed, unpaid, something that we need to raise the resilience, and we have to support their work, the trauma, how the psychological scars are affecting. We are not talking about that. What is the type of the iceberg, but what happened after? The consequences last for years, for decades, and we need to focus on this. The education on exile, how all these kids that had to run away from their houses, cross the Mediterranean, they have to leave their places and are struggling right now with unofficial studies. Patriotic education is another problem. And especially right now, these days in Europe, we can see in Russia, in Ukraine, in Nagorno-Karabakh, this problem is getting worse and worse and worse, with the idea of the National Socialism and the idea of belonging to a country, to a nation, to an idea. No, it's another problem that is knocking again the doors, especially in Europe. The e-learning programs. We have the nightmare, but we need to find ways to overcome the nightmare and to move forward. The learning programs are reaching isolated communities, are reaching devastated communities. We need to rise and we need to highlight these initiatives, because suddenly it's a game changer, has becoming a game changer for students are teachers, and it's quite important. And from my side, the most important point, the quest to reclaim their universe, because schools for the childhood is their universe, is the safe space, is their house where all the friends are there, where all they have the best memories, and we need to try to keep them as a safe school, safe spaces for them. War has different aspects, have different phases, no? Direct attacks, airstrikes, like this one in Al-Hasake, can destroy the school and can be ruined for decades, because sometimes it's more difficult to invest, to restore these places, no? Normally, this kind of attacks, airstrikes are coming because some militant groups are hiding themselves there. This a kindergarten using by an armed force as a base, no? Doesn't matter. Armed groups, official groups, in all conflicts, educational institutions are being used as a basis, and something that we have to raise awareness, the policymakers, that they should stop. And can be European countries, can be international actors, they are using the schools as a basis for educational institutions. The way to school. The way to school is too important. They can be underselling, they can be hijacked, kidnapping, harassment. We have to protect, we have to raise awareness about that. It's not only the problematic of attacks on education, just only how to destroy schools or institutions. There are different factors involving the problematic. It's a multipolymorphic factor or problems that we have to focus on is the consequences, the human consequences. In this case, for example, Zainab from Basra, she was collecting metal, and she was injured by unexploded ordinances. We need to support all these awareness campaigns to try to make a point clear and to give to the students all the tools to identify possible threats. And one of these threats, after a conflict is finished, is the ordinance or the unexploded ordinances. In this case, Mihailo was injured, his father was killed, his brother was injured too, and he, at the consequences of the war, he has to face difficult medical surgery operation, he's facing trauma, and he has to move forward, no? It's not a number, it's not a statistic, it's not a study, it's not a research. These are the human consequences, the phases of how war affects education. Another quite important point, the mental consequences. I found this trial after the Yazidi genocide a couple of years ago. It was part of a program, rehabilitation psychological program, to support the Yazidi kids. No, we have to give them the tools to express themselves in order to move forward with their ghost. It's not only that they have been injured. We need to support the psychological rehabilitation in order to embrace a new reality, to come back to life. And from my side, the real heroes of these stories are, one of the real heroes are the teachers, because no matter that they are selling, no matter that they are under airstrikes or under the threat of kidnapping, they're willing to keep teaching to the kids, no? War has different consequences, and what is left behind the war, no? And we need to try to gather synergies between researchers, academic, NGO workers, foundation, storytellers, to try to find the same path to raise awareness and to make a prompt into the policymakers.
Diego?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to see if we could hold some of the rest of the photos towards the end.
Yep.
Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You'll see from the chat that people were very engaged with the photos that you have shared so far. And your photography is so powerful and doesn't put into words, takes what we cannot put into words into these photos. So thank you so much for sharing these, and your work has touched many in the presentation and audience today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So we're going to transition to our last speaker. I do want to note that in the chat, I'm very thrilled that the audience has taken our intro to heart of how much that we want people to engage with one another and ask questions and share resources. So there have been many opportunities along the way that people have had their questions answered. And we will continue to follow up and share resources after this is completed. But I do want to pass it to Delphine Dorsey to introduce an accountability brief and to really leave us with the last word of the state of where we are with this type of work going forward. So passing it to you, Delphine.
Thank you, Alison. And while I'm preparing my presentation, if this works. Yeah. While I'm preparing the presentation, I want to acknowledge the work of Diego I really admire, and I'm sorry we cut you a bit before the end, especially as you are going to present your participatory work, which I think is very powerful. So I really encourage everyone to look into your website to get more information and be in touch with you. And I'm sharing my slide. Yes, okay. So, as Juliana explained earlier, the Right to Education initiative have collaborated with Amnesty International Netherlands and partner in the Sahel region to monitor the impact of the closure of school on children's rights, and particularly their right to education. And in the implementation of this pilot project, we faced several challenges and wish to discuss about our experience with other researchers and organizations involved in similar projects across the world. In last July, we organized an online roundtable which brought together around 30 researchers, practitioners, and civil society actors working in monitoring the right to education in conflict-affected regions, both from local and global perspective. We know access to reliable, context-sensitive data on education in such context is essential for informing public policy, advocacy, and protection measures. However, collecting accurate, timely, and comprehensive data on attack on education and on the impact of school closure on children and educational professionals pose several ethical, methodological, logistical, and security challenges. During this roundtable, we exchanged about our respective experiences and reflected about solutions to address the challenges we face. We collectively come up with key 5 insights and strategic recommendations I'm going to briefly present to you now. And note that the brief is being translated in French, Spanish, and Arabic. So, first insight. Lack of data is a reality, and this has a crucial impact on what we know and how we address attack on education. Data on attack on education are either not fully collected or disclosed. The impact of this attack on communities, teachers, and children's life, and particularly on their rights, is largely under-researched and absent from most of existing analyses. The absence of reliable data fosters ambiguity and can lead to misrepresentation of the reality on the ground, either obscuring the severity of a situation or underestimating positive development. Second, research in conflict-affected contexts has always been risky, but the shrinking of civic space in volatile and sensitive political contexts has critically undermined research development and dissemination. There are risks for different types of people, researchers and organizations conducting the study, community actors involved in the research, those willing to share their account of events, and even for those who are not taking part in the research but may be perceived as collaborating with data collection. The risks we are talking about include threat to oneself or to one's family, violence injuries, death, confiscation of materials, arrest, suspension of activities, restriction on data collection efforts, such as administrative constraints and suspicions with regard to human rights monitoring, create critical barriers for the collection of data. The shrinking of civic space has led to the suspension of research activity or the closure of legitimate civil society organizations, as well as censorship, including self-censorship. Sometimes, even when collected, data cannot be published for safety reasons. 3. Security and ethics are not negotiable, but some flexibility in research processes is necessary to allow for data to surface while ensuring safe, ethical, quality data collection. Risk assessment and mitigation is essential to ensure access to data as well as the safety of all those involved in the research process. Nevertheless, not everything can be predicted in advance, and some flexibility in research protocol and methodology should be accepted and validated, from the early age of the research design to the production of final research reports. Classical research methods may not be tailored to high-risk and rapidly evolving contexts. Ensuring that all relevant information on the methodology and research process is documented is not always possible. Sometimes, researchers cannot disclose the negotiating process on the ground in order to have access to certain conflict-affected zones. Random interviewee selection may sometimes be constrained by field dynamics, and following cohorts may be complicated due to people displacement and difficulties to keep track of individual movements across territories and borders. Therefore, researchers should be encouraged to develop innovative research scenarios, adapt research protocol, and combine multiple methodologies. Anonymity, informed consent, and ethical clearance procedures should be adjusted to take into consideration the specific constraint of data collection in each context. Standardized statistical research methods that often fail in volatile contexts need to be adapted to take into consideration population displacement, access challenges, and evolving security risk. Moreover, local-based knowledge of actors working on education and on child protection should not be undermined due to methodology and research constraints linked to Western-centric research standards that may actually be unfit to high-risk setting and specific local reality. For instance, it should be accepted to obtain verbal consent from participants that are anonymized by researchers to preserve their safety. Not naming the author of the research in the reporting process, and not disclosing all the detail of the research methodology when this may put researchers or their partner on the ground at risk. Innovative research methods, as well as transparent iterative research, including the use of recall methods, remote interviews, and cross-verification through local media or satellite data should be valued and encouraged. Fourth insight, communities and local civil society organizations have embodied and contextualized experience of the reality on the ground. Their involvement in research is essential but underfunded. Local organizations are best placed to access affected population and build trust, but lack resources, protection, and recognition. Moreover, with authoritarian rule entering public space in many parts of the world and major decrease in funding for development, many international organizations are cancelling important programs and stepping out of place affected by conflict and protracted crisis. If international funding does not reach local actors, there is little chance that accurate, timely information about what is happening on the ground will be collected. Fifth and last, the global funding crisis, including at the UN level, is threatening the continuity of critical monitoring systems, undermining our ability to design and implement tailored public policy which ensures that no one is left behind. Relevant funding policy must be backed up by data and robust monitoring system. But no data revolution is possible if data collection continues to be underfunded. The UN liquidity crisis, as well as recent major cuts in development funding, have further compromised the ability of many actors to collect and analyze data. As highlighted in a policy brief published last month by INEE, the Education in Emergency Hub and the Global Education Cluster, aid cuts have had a devastating impact on education in emergencies. The various nature of conflict dynamic and the constantly evolving situation on the ground call for sustainable funding with flexible adaptive management rules. Building trusted relationships over time is crucial to ensure access to quality research, even more in high-risk settings where violence and political tension drive communities' behavior and foster distrust and fear of reprisals. Yet, this is often incompatible with donor timelines and short-term project cycle. So our fifth recommendation for all of us: put data collection and analysis at the heart of education policies in fragile and conflict-affected countries, ensuring that policies are designed and implemented based on evidence. Ensure that researchers and civil society organizations find a collaborative environment that fosters independent data collection and dissemination. Research freedom and independence needs to be acknowledged and respected. 3. Recognize and support flexible, situational, and culturally adapted methodology in academic and donor framework and encourage innovative methodologies that ensure the safety of all stakeholders involved in research, while at the same time respecting alternative ethical and epistemological standards. Ensure that international advocacy includes voices and data from underrepresented zones, even when fragmentary. 4th, ensure that communities' voices are heard by acknowledging, valuing, and facilitating local knowledge and research methods, including by involving local researchers and civil society organizations. Step up to the commitment to delocalized aid by funding local organizations to collect and analyze data. And finally, ensure that data collection and analysis are backed up by sustained continuous funding to allow for timely and sensitive research, while at the same time acknowledging the challenges of doing research in conflict-affected areas. As I said, you can get all the brief and our recommendations that we collectively pulled together in the roundtable in July on our website in 4 languages. Thank you very much.
So as we leave today, I invite us all to carry forward this shared understanding that every data set, every testimony, every image represents not just information, but lives disrupted and a right that must be defended. Our task is to ensure that this evidence in all of its various forms is not only collected, but also acted upon, so that education remains a space of safety and hope, even in the most difficult circumstances. Thank you for your time and engagement today. You will find the recording on the Right to Education website shortly after our event today in the upcoming days. And we've gotten many requests for additional resources, and we will respond to those as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating in such an engaging conversation, particularly over the chat. And we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you.